All right, welcome back. This lecture is going to be about classification. This is part of the evolution unit. So if you have the guided notes, that'd be great to follow along with. But I'm going to start out with asking you, who am I thinking of? So I want you to write down on a piece of paper to write down who you think I'm thinking of. All right, I'm going to give you a hint, and after each hint, I want you to write down or change who you think I am thinking of, and we'll see if you can get who I'm thinking of before I get to the end. So known as Homo sapiens. Has homozygous sex chromosomes, lives in the United States, is of African American descent, is a public figure, is a philanthropist, is married to Barack Obama. Now, by now, hopefully you guessed that that is Michelle Obama, but I want you to ask yourself, when did you actually figure it out? Now, if you figured it out all the way up here, then, maybe you're just a really, really good guesser. If you figured it out down here, still a pretty good guesser, but, you've had a lot of information to help lead you along. This one, very specific. There's only one person who's married to President Obama, and so that's obviously Michelle Obama. If we do another example, this one done in my classroom, so I start out saying, what am I thinking of in the room? We can go, it's a solid, it's heavy, you can put things in or on it, it's made of metal, it opens up, it has 4 legs, and you should never touch it. Hopefully by this point in time you got to the fact that that's my desk. But at the very beginning, there's a lot of things that are in my classroom, and a lot of things that are solid. Think of all the things that could fit in there, chairs, students, tables, the ceiling tiles, books, all that kind of stuff. It's heavy, tables, there's a lot of things in my room, the cabinets that are heavy. You can put things in or on it. Still not very specific. It's made of metal. Ooh, that should narrow it down a little bit because, our cabinets are made of wood. Students are not made of metal. It opens up. It has 4 legs. We're getting more and more specific as we go down. Now, what's the point of this exercise? Well, it has to do with how we classify organisms. And so if I look at these organisms that you see around here, you may recognize several of these, but let me ask you the question, which one's the gopher? Did you pick this one? Or did you pick this one? Or maybe this one? Perhaps you chose this guy. Or that one. Well, the fact of the matter is, all of these are gophers depending on what part of the country you're in. So this is kind of a trick question. So if I say gopher, you might have been thinking about this guy down here with nasty orange teeth, or this guy, or you might be thinking of something more like this. The point is that gopher can actually apply to more than one organism. What about a bear? I want you to picture in your mind what a bear looks like. Which one were you thinking of? And maybe you weren't thinking of any of these. You might have been thinking of a different kind of bear. So when we look at the word bear, that's not very specific because, we could be thinking of a sun bear here, or what I like to refer to as the Mr. T of the bear world. This is a brown bear. This is a grizzly bear. This is a polar bear, and this is a panda bear, which, not nearly as close related as these guys are to each other. But these are all what we would consider to be a bear. But they're all different species. So the word bear is not very specific. And in fact, bear and gopher are both what we would call a common name. And the problem with common names is they're not very specific. Depending on what locality you're in, bear, you might be thinking of this. If you were, an Alaskan Indian, you might think bear and think of polar bear. If you lived in the Rockies, you might think of, brown bear or grizzly bear. So depending on where you're at, this term bear can mean different things. So there's a lot of ambiguity when we're referring to different organisms or confusion. And so this guy, Linnaeus, was all about disambiguity. He wanted to make everything as specific as possible. And so he came up with this naming structure called binomial nomenclature. Now we've talked about nomenclature before. That's just, the jargon or the naming structure that we use for a given area of science. Um, binomial. Bi means two, and then nomial refers to name. So binomial nomenclature literally means this is a two-name naming structure. And so every single species on the planet has two scientific names that only apply to it. For example, you might recognize this one, Homo sapiens. What does that refer to? Well, hopefully we all know that that refers to humans. Linnaeus is a Homo sapien. When I say Homo sapien, there's no ambiguity there. We know that we are talking about humans. Now, there's a few rules that go along with this nomenclature. First of all, the first word is always called the genus. The second word is always the species name. Now, notice a couple things here about my genus and species. When I write the genus, I always capitalize the first letter. When I write the species, it's always lowercase. So we capitalize the genus, lowercase the species. Another rule is I always have to have my genus with my species. I can never just write sapiens. And maybe here's would be a better explanation of why. Let's say that I told you to go out and bring me a musculus. That is a species name. So I say, go out and find me a musculus. Well, one of you might bring me a musculus, which is just a mouse. But what if somebody, and I'm just going to, for the sake of times, I'm not going to rewrite musculus. Let's say somebody brought me a Balaenoptera. And that might not be spelled right, but Balaenoptera musculus. That's a blue whale. So if I just say, bring me a musculus, that's not very specific. One student could bring me a mouse, another one would have the arduous task of bringing me a blue whale. That's a big difference. We're going from one of the smallest mammals in the world to the biggest mammal, all because of the genus name. So when we are referring to a species, we have to have the genus name with the species. Now you can't abbreviate it, like I could say H. sapiens, but the point is that the genus has to be there. Now, the other thing that you may have noticed that I keep doing is I'm underlining these. You either have to underline genus and species names or italicize them. So if you're typing, you might just italicize them, but anytime you write them by hand, you have to underline them. Okay, so a few rules here. Capitalize the genus, lowercase the species. If you're going to write a species name, you always have to have the genus with it, or at least the abbreviation for it. And it either has to be underlined or italicized. Those are just a few rules that all scientists have agreed upon. And so if I ask you what the scientific name for a polar bear is, it's Ursus maritimus. But if you just put maritimus, I'm going to say no, that's wrong because you don't have the genus with it. So you have to represent the genus with it. So Linnaeus put together this entire hierarchy of naming and classifying organisms, and it was mostly based on physical similarities. He didn't have, a complex understanding of genetics and things like that. So it was mostly, the things that look like alike got put in similar categories. And so this right here is our hierarchy. Kingdom would be the broadest category. That's going to incorporate lots of organisms that are loosely related, but could look very, very different. And then phylum gets a little more specific. Class, order, family, genus, and species. And by the time you get down here to genus and species, especially the species level, we're very specific. That's only one type of organism when we're at the species level. Whereas kingdom, you could be talking about thousands of different organisms. Just like when we did this example at the beginning, it's a solid. That's not very specific. That's a kingdom level classifier. It's heavy. That's a little more specific, so phylum level. You can put things in or on it. Maybe we're getting down to the class level, and then maybe order, and then family, and then genus, and then species. Man, it's almost like I planned this out. As we go from kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, we're getting more and more specific, or we're ruling out others that don't belong. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, that's going from least specific to most specific. So the number of kingdoms has not always been the same. So this is the broadest category. It's changed over time. So like in the 1700s, we just had two kingdoms, Plantae and Animalia. So anything that moved around and we would classically think of as an animal went in that kingdom. Everything else went in kingdom Plantae. So that would include things like bacteria and protists and mold and mushrooms and all these kinds of things would all go in the kingdom Plantae. By the late 1800s, we realized this was too broad, so we separated it into Protista and Plantae. Animalia stayed the same. By the 1950s, we separated out Plantae into fungi, so those would be things like mushrooms that we normally think of as a fungus. And then we have the real plants. And we had Protista got separated into Monera and Protista. Monera is what we now think of as the bacteria, so eubacteria and archaebacteria. And Protista, protists are a lot of these little things that swim around in pond water. We'll get a chance to look at those when we go outside in a couple weeks. But they're little single-celled organisms, or maybe several of them that live in a colony together. A lot of times we find them living in water. Pretty simple. Examples would be things like Euglena, Paramecia, amoebas. Those would all be protistans. And so that was as recent as the 1990s. Well, why do you think the number of kingdoms has changed over time? It's mainly because as we've gone along, we've discovered more about these organisms with the advent of things like genetics and looking at the evolutionary relationship between these. We've learned that, things like an oak tree and a mushroom, they both are stationary, they both grow from the ground. So we'd group them in plants a long time ago, but now we see there's a lot of differences between those. They're not very closely related at all. So we had to put them in separate kingdoms. This right here is a cladogram. A cladogram kind of helps us look at those physical characteristics that separate out different groups and then kind of show how they're related to each other. So for example, here we've got the traits that separate out these groups. A hagfish is separated from a perch because perches have jaws, whereas a hagfish has no jaws. What separates a perch from a salamander, one characteristic could be lungs. A salamander has lungs, it can live on land, whereas a perch can't. Now, these aren't the only characteristics, but these are just a few that we're choosing to represent here. A salamander is separate from a lizard by, well, lizards, among other things, have claws or nails. Again, there's other things that separate lizards from salamanders, but this is just one. If we keep going, pigeons have feathers, so that's separate from mice and chimps because they have fur. Something that might separate a chimp from a mouse would be something like an opposable thumb. And there's many other things too, like binocular vision and the ability to walk upright or on two legs. Bipedalism, those could all be things that would separate a chimp. But the fact is, there's something that separates these groups out. And so cladograms often show us what we call derived versus ancestral traits. And these are relative terms. So if we look at something, let's look at the mouse and the chimp. A derived trait is a trait that's fairly recently developed that they both have in common. So for example, fur and mammary glands. For these two, the mouse and the chimp, that is a derived trait. Okay? It sets them apart from everything before them. An ancestral trait would be something that if we group, let's see, these two together with, say, the salamander, these two share the trait of having lungs. Well, that's an ancestral trait. It's a long ways back, especially for the mouse and chimp. This doesn't separate them from each other, so it's an ancestral trait. So derived traits, more recent. Ancestral traits are much older. Very closely related to cladograms is this idea of phylogeny. Phylogeny, we're grouping our organisms together, but this is based on evolutionary descent. So Linnaeus, he was all about the physical characteristics and what he could see. But what we've actually found is that physical similarities a lot of times are a good indicator that things are closely related, but not always. So most of the time, most physical similarities are still grouped together, but a physical similarity does not guarantee that two organisms will be in the same group. Here's an example of this would be what we call, this is phylogeny, so this would be a phylogenetic tree. Notice I don't have physical traits on here anymore. I'm just looking at how these organisms are related to each other. And so if we look at, say, the domesticated dog, this might be a good test question. What is the most closely related animal on this list to the domesticated dog? Well, if you look, we have to trace back its lineage until we find, this is called a node, where we've got another branch coming off of it. The gray wolf is the most closely related organism to the domesticated dog. And we have to go back, this is million years before present, so this is right here, 1.5 million years ago. That's when the domesticated dog and the gray wolf shared an ancestor. Now, this doesn't mean that the domesticated dog came from the gray wolf. These two came from some ancestral species. It may have looked a lot like the gray wolf, but it wasn't necessarily the gray wolf. If we want to look at, let's say, the domesticated dog and the gray fox, well, we start tracing back until they share a lineage, and we have to go all the way back to here. Oops, yep, that's the one I want. So if you look, here is where they most recently shared a common ancestor, 10 million years ago. So the gray fox, even though they look a lot like some dogs, they share similar characteristics, they are much farther away from each other in terms of relationship because they evolved in separate branches from each other a long time ago. So all the way back here, 10 million years ago, there was some, ancient canine species that some of them evolved into the gray fox, the others evolved into this branch, which ultimately led to the domesticated dog. Okay, so phylogeny, we're looking at evolutionary relationships. A little back to, well, once phylogeny got going, we started seeing that our kingdoms that we had talked about previously, so eubacteria, archaebacteria, protista, fungi, planta, animalia, those weren't actually broad enough. Things like the bacteria and the archaebacteria were way too different from each other to actually be in the same, to be in just separate kingdoms. We needed a completely different group to set them apart. And so we came up with what we call the domain. So the domain is now the largest group. It's the broadest group, and there are three of them: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria, that's pretty obvious. Things that we think of as bacteria, so like E. coli would be in the domain bacteria. Archaea, these are what we think of as extreme organisms. They live in places like deep sea vents or sulfur hot springs, places that are really, really nasty and most things can't live. And then we've got the eukarya. As the name suggests, eukarya are all eukaryotes, which, remember from our cells unit, eukaryote means that they have a nucleus. So things like animal, fungi, plants, diatoms, these little things found in the water that we'll look at. Ciliates, so things like amoebas, or not amoebas, paramecium and euglena. We are actually in the same domain as them. Slime molds. You are in the same domain as a slime mold. You are more closely related to a slime mold than you are to something like, let's say, purple bacteria or cyanobacteria. That's be like algae. You're more closely related to a slime mold than you are to them. And what's really interesting is that our common ancestor with bacteria is all the way back here. So if you notice, we are more closely related to these extreme organisms like the archaea than we are to bacteria. And it's funny because, we actually have bacteria living in us. You have E. coli in your intestines, but this archaea is actually more closely related to us than the bacteria are. So here's the kind of an overview. These are our three domains again. Remember, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. If we go to the kingdom level, there's only one kingdom in each of these domains. So the kingdom in bacteria is eubacteria, or the true bacteria. The kingdom in archaea is archaebacteria. And then in eukarya, we've got four kingdoms: protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. You obviously are an animal. So there's some descriptions of things that, kind of what characterizes each of these groups. And so I'd like you to, take a look at this. It's on your guided notes, but maybe take a look just to see what the differences are between these. Some examples, these are bacteria. Bacteria come in different shapes. This guy right here, this spiral, is called a spirillum. These little guys right here that are kind of round shaped, those are cocci. And then these that are kind of rod shaped are called bacillus. So there's three shapes of bacteria here, and that's how we classify bacteria a lot, is by their shape. So this would be coccus, this would be spirilla, this would be bacillus. We can also classify them based upon how they're grouped. See, there's two of these bacteria grouped together. That'd be diplococcus, di meaning two, and coccus because they're round. This would be diplobacillus because there's two bacillus next to each other. We've also got things like strepto. So we think of strep throat, it has to do with the bacteria that's got the strepto arrangement that's arranged in chains. So this would be a streptococcus because it's in chains. And then we've also got staphylo, which means clumps. So if you just have a whole bunch of these bacteria clumped together, that'd be staphylo. So like staph infections of your skin or, inside, those are done by a bacteria that's in clumps. This right here, this would probably be Staphylobacillus because it's just a clump of bacillus there. Archaea, again, really, really simple primitive life forms. They're really found in extreme places like here. This is a sulfur hot spring in Yellowstone. This is a deep sea vent way below the surface of the ocean. Extremely hot water. The water is above boiling point, but because the pressure is so high, it's still liquid. But it's rising up. You got sulfur spewing out of these, stuff that would normally kill other organisms. The archaea can live there. And then you've got eukarya. So these would be like the protists living in the water that we talked about. And here's a fungus or a mushroom. This would be a plant. It's a fern. And then we've got, the capybara. They're fun. World's largest rodent. They would be in the domain eukarya. These are all eukaryans because they have nuclei in their cells. So they're eukaryotes. That's what defines eukarya. And then these are just a couple of different webs that we won't really talk about. But so Linnaeus, remember, originally came up with this kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Well, now we have to add one more above that, and that's domain. And there's a way that you can remember these in order. I always learned it as King Philip came over for grape soda. Well, I learned this before we knew about domains because I'm a little bit older than you. And so we had to change our mnemonic device from King Philip came over for grape soda to did King Philip come over for grape soda? So if you can remember, did King Philip come over for grape soda? That'll help you get those in order. And that'll be it.